anybody who's still talking about this rupture and this change in the short term needs to get their optimism shaken out of them, right? Like, this is not a thing that will resolve itself in 6 months.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. About 24 hours before the Halifax International Security Forum kicked off on Friday, November 21st, news broke of a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine that emerged from meetings between American and Russian officials. This plan reads like a laundry list of Russian demands. And it was backed up by a threat from the Trump administration to cut off Ukraine should they not accept it by Thanksgiving in the United States. The Halifax International Security Forum always includes a sizable and bipartisan group of United States senators who are suddenly put on the spot. Did they think Ukraine should accept this ultimatum? By Saturday afternoon, several senators issued a joint statement condemning this plan. Then something extraordinary happened. A couple hours after this joint statement was released, an even larger and more bipartisan group of senators gave a press conference in which Republican Senator Mike Rounds said that he and two other senators had just got off the phone with Marco Rubio, who told him that this stridently pro-Russian 28-point plan was not an American plan at all, but rather a Russian proposal that was improperly leaked. But then, about 2 hours later, Rubio publicly disavowed that disavowal. He posted on Twitter saying, quote, "The peace proposal was authored by the U.S." So what the heck is going on here? I caught up with Toronto Star columnist and fellow Substacker Justin Ling to try to make sense of this bizarre turn of events. We kick off discussing the back and forth on this plan, then have a deeper conversation about what this episode reveals about American global leadership and what the conversations in Halifax revealed about how America's traditional middle power allies like Canada and Europe are adjusting to a world order in which the United States is an unreliable ally and an unstable international actor. We recorded our conversation live from the Halifax International Security Forum on the tail end of the forum itself. A big thank you to the conveners of the Halifax Forum for having me there again this year. I get so much great content out of this forum that I am so pleased to bring to you. Now here is my conversation with Toronto Star columnist and fellow Substacker Justin Ling. So, Justin, we're speaking from the Halifax International Security Forum, one of, at least for me personally, like the more valuable of these kinds of gatherings for a number of reasons. You know, my audience cares deeply about multilateralism. This is a multilateral affair, though it's one in which it's a real conversation among friends and allies. The intention behind Halifax is to get allies together to talk about issues of common and mutual importance, and also to mix it up a little bit. But this is not the kind of conference where you're going to get like a speech from like a Chinese or Russian authority. This is really all about democratic partnerships and democratic allies.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Over the years, it has played kind of different roles in different international conflicts and geopolitical tension. Yeah, every year there's always kind of a thematic element to it. Like this year, the word democracy is splashed over the stage, and everything is sort of geared around, what do democracies do? How do they act? How do they survive? How do they thrive? And every year, some iteration of, that theme. But it also just becomes a place where world leaders and civil society and journalists and everybody else can get in the same room, can have bilateral meetings, can have off the record dinners and conversations. And it always just ends up falling on a weekend where something, I mean, there's always something happening. Obviously, the world is chaotic. But in particular, just because of the timing of it, late November, it's always right after a US presidential election. It always seems to coincide with, at least over the last number of years, something absurd President Trump has done. It has become a real useful forum for the Ukrainians, but also for the Taiwanese, also for the Syrians, the Yemeni, a whole bunch of others. So this weekend has been pretty jam packed and up there in terms of one of the most consequential of the forums, at least the ones I've attended. And I think this is my 10th.
Yeah, this year, and we'll get into it, Halifax was in the center of world history for a few reasons, which we'll discuss. So there's always a large and bipartisan congressional delegation. There are about 8 senators here from the United States, led by Jeanne Shaheen on the Democrat side and Mike Rounds from South Dakota on the Republican side. And let's get right into it. So about 48 to 24 hours before the conference kicked off, we learned details of this 28-point plan for scare quote peace in Ukraine. And just like a few of those elements of that plan include Ukraine giving up territory to Russia that Russia hadn't even conquered yet. It includes Ukraine voluntarily dismantling a large proportion of its military. It includes guarantees that Ukraine won't ever join NATO, all for a really vague security guarantee from the United States. Now, the knock on this plan was that it looks like it was probably written by Russia. And just as the conference kicked off, journalists, including Nick Schifrin of PBS, was on stage kind of grilling the members of Congress. Do you support this plan?
Let's start with just the plan itself, right? Because I think this is incredibly important. And I actually don't think a lot of the coverage of this has appropriately underscored the degree to which this plan is not just bad, but a capitulation and just full on a copying of the Russian negotiating position. So I've been following these negotiations such as they are for, as Paul Wells points out, scare quote, peace for a peace deal since they've kind of started earlier this year and really 2 or 3 years ago. But ever since Ukraine first agreed to start having conversations about a possible plan, the Russian position has always been we want to achieve through negotiation, which we could not do through military action, which is that we want to seize full on the 4 oblasts, 4 provinces or states of Ukraine, which we declared sovereignty over through a complete Potemkin fake referendum that occurred a couple of years ago. Um, Ukraine naturally could never say yes to this, right? Like it's completely inconceivable that Ukraine would just surrender huge swaths of territory. And more importantly, millions of people, or at the very least hundreds of thousands. We don't quite know what the population of some of these areas is at the moment. But the suggestion is that Ukraine would just hand over its citizens full on to Russia and critically would hand over its fortifications in Donetsk, which is basically the red line past which Russia would have a hell of a time breaking through. So that is what Russia has tried to do at the negotiating table. And, under Joe Biden, of course, the position was that's inconceivable. We could never, ever accede to that. Um, Under Trump, there has been this incredible willingness to entertain that idea and also to put on the table other completely, let's say it frankly, batshit ideas like total amnesty for Vladimir Putin and everyone else in Russia for the clear war crimes and potential genocide that has occurred in Ukraine, like a firm and aggressive cap on the size of the Ukrainian military, but also a swearing off of NATO, but also this insane deal that is cooked up by Trump that would give the US half of the profits from a joint venture with Ukraine to kind of pay back the support they provided over the last number of years, but also would normalize relations with Russia and create a joint investment fund of some kind with Moscow. This is the plan that was proposed some 6 months ago with some slight variants. It's the plan that was cooked up in Alaska by Putin and Trump 3-ish months ago. And now it is word for word the 28-point plan that has gone out in the media. There is nothing new here. This is the same plan that's been around for ages. It's the same plan that was completely unacceptable then. And I don't understand how anyone's talking about it now as though it's a serious starting point for a peace deal.
Well, one thing that is new, though, is an ultimatum that Trump
Yeah.
issued, which is Ukraine accept this plan by Thursday, Thanksgiving down in the United States, or the insinuation is we will cut off support for Ukraine. So that was like the state of play coming into this conference. And the bipartisan delegation, I think, uniformly criticized this as being really just like a Russian cooked up plan. It didn't seem to serve American interests, Ukrainian interests in much meaningful way. And there was, I think, a consensus, I don't want to speak for the senators, but most of them, if not all of them, kind of rejected the idea behind this 28-point plan. So that brings us to the events of the last 24 hours. Do you just want to like whipsaw of emotions and jaw-dropping moments here in Halifax and how Halifax drove this story? I'll let you take the story away.
There is an interesting point here, though, that the congressional delegation, which included a number of Republicans, there was this somewhat candid kind of the deal clearly has problems and we couldn't accept it as it is. But there was also on the flip side this sort of suggestion of, well, it's Trump. Trump does Trump. He's unpredictable and he likes to start from an extreme and then negotiate back, art of the deal and all that. So what they were actually doing was spinning the idea that maybe this deal actually is a serious position from the US government as an attempt to get Ukraine to accept terms that they otherwise wouldn't say yes to, which is kind of offensive in and of its own right. But nevertheless, that was the line from the Republicans, so that it was a real offer, but not the final offer. That's the phrase that Trump would actually kind of later use on Saturday afternoon. But what happens is this plan gets announced. Everybody says, we're here talking to the Canadians, the Europeans, the Ukrainians. All of them are saying we haven't seen the deal. We don't actually know what's in the deal. Even the congressional delegation is saying that. Eventually, those 28 points get leaked. And like I said, it's exactly what you'd expect. They've tempered a couple of the expectations, but it's still a full handing over of Donetsk, still cap on the military. It's still a swearing off of NATO. And we get this press conference from the congressional delegation yesterday evening around 6 p.m. here in Halifax. And they get up on stage and basically say, we just got off the phone with Marco Rubio. He assured us that this plan is not the American position. In fact, as you may expect, it is the Russian position. We even hear, I think it was Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican, say there's even some indication the original text of the deal was in Russian, right? This very clear sign that it didn't even come from the Americans. He said the release was not approved. He said the Thursday deadline was not real. He says that there is no expectation that America would cut off any intelligence sharing or weapons assistance. He basically said this entire story is fake news. He did confirm that there were negotiations. He did confirm that there were positions being swapped back and forth. He pointed out, of course, that a bunch of Ukrainian, European, Canadian, American officials are on their way to Geneva to try to hammer out some kind of real deal, but we shouldn't get our hopes up for that. But basically said, don't worry about it. Marco Rubio has confirmed to us that this is not what's going on and that this is all a big misunderstanding.
Yeah. This
And
is not
everyone
an
in the room,
American deal. This is not an American
yeah,
plan. Rubio called these senators en route to Geneva, where he was meeting with Ukrainian and European partners, and said, we were just the intermediaries. This is a Russian plan that was leaked. It's not our plan. Like, oopsie.
and what happens next, Mark?
Well, what happens next
Please.
is I go to an off the record dinner, you go to an off the record dinner. I'm not like looking at my phone. I'm trying to like be present, engaging. Then a couple hours later, I meet you at the bar downstairs and you show me the tweet from Secretary Rubio, who said, in fact, this is an American plan, basically throwing the senators who had briefed us previously under the bus.
It's unbelievable. He fully threw his fellow senators, including some Republicans, under the bus. Just the clarity with which, especially Senator Mike Rounds, who, by the way, is close to Trump, who I think identifies with Trump's general foreign policy approach on many, many fronts, who is, no, I'll use the administration's parlance, is no kind of rabid globalist, right? But also is an ardent supporter of Ukraine. Mike Rounds was entirely clear right? Like there was no room for misunderstanding. He was point blank in saying, Rubio called us. And the other senators, by the way, were on the call as well and confirmed this version of
Yeah,
events.
yeah.
Rubio was 100% clear that this was not the American position. There was no deadline, no threat, that America was not pushing Ukraine to give up Donetsk, all this other stuff. And then for Rubio to come and just completely push them off the bridge and say, no, in fact, that's exactly what we're saying. That's exactly our position. It's unbelievable. And I'll tell you what, when we were still of the belief that this was all a big misunderstanding, I got up and I asked Senator Rounds, and I chose my words very carefully. I said, everyone here is left doing Kremlinology, right? Like everyone in this room is lacking insight from the administration. The most insight we've gotten into the White House's thinking has been a phone call relayed through you to us and to everyone else in this room, right? Like we got out of that room and I'm going over to the Canadian, European, Ukrainian officials and saying, don't worry, it's all off. The whole threat is off. Don't worry about it. And that's how they learned about it, right? So that phone call kind of filters through the room and I think later made its way to Johannesburg. I was actually speaking to some Canadian officials today who were in Johannesburg saying, like, we haven't heard from the Americans at all, because of course the Americans are boycotting the
Yeah,
G20
Johannesburg
summit.
is the site of the just concluded G20 summit,
Yeah. So
which the United States did not participate in.
America's boycotting that at a protest for, violence against white farmers. America is boycotting Halifax at a protest of the globalists. So we're basically playing phone tag with Marco Rubio to figure out what the hell the US actually supports. And I got up and asked Senator Rounds, I'm like, we're all left doing Kremlinology, trying to figure out who's actually setting American foreign policy at this point. Can you give us any indication? Is it Witkoff, the Ukraine envoy? Is it Rubio? Is it Trump? Is it Vance? Tell us what's happening. And he really couldn't. He really came down to, we're doing our best and yeah, we're a little confused.
What do we know thus far about what's happening in Geneva today? So Halifax wraps up in just a couple hours. And really, this Ukraine story now moves from Halifax to Geneva, where Rubio is supposedly meeting with Ukrainians and European partners, and now apparently embraces this plan as an American plan, which he disavowed as a Russian plan just a few hours ago.
Yeah, I mean, we have no idea. Like, I know that the European, Ukrainian, Canadian security officials are joining in Geneva. It's going to be a national security advisor level meeting. The Canadian NSIA is going. Ukraine is sending Andrei Yermak, the right hand man, to President Zelensky. So it's going to be a serious meeting of minds here. But what I think the last 48 hours has underlined is that we really don't know who's determining the American position. And I think that's what's really interesting about all of this.
Mhm.
I'm inferring from this that Marco Rubio has been frozen out, undermined, and fundamentally frustrated in his efforts to actually get a real peace deal for Ukraine. Look at all of the people who are on the other side of this, right? Witkoff is, let's put it, politely, I guess, unbelievably inclined to the Russian position. He's made that clear. He has business interests in Russia. He was the one sitting down with Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. It was the two of them who supposedly hammered out the final version of this deal, such as it is. We know that JD Vance and a close associate of his were leading some of the outreach to the Ukrainian side. Drew Driscoll is in the Pentagon. He went to Ukraine to kind of brief Zelensky on the state of this peace negotiation, peace in scare quotes. It was after that meeting that 24 hours later that President Zelensky comes out and says, we're now forced to choose between our dignity, our sovereignty, and our closest ally, kind of setting the stakes that basically, I think it's his understanding that if they don't accept this deal, then help from America is off the table. And from the Ukrainians I speak to, they're under the same impression. And by the way, Drew Driscoll, very close to JD Vance, very much of that sort of America first anti-globalist, anti-Ukraine camp within the administration. And then also just yesterday, Reuters is reporting that I think Don Trump Jr. was meeting with a sanctioned Russian oligarch in Miami to talk about the next steps for the peace negotiations. So to me, we're playing criminology here a little bit, but
Yeah.
to me, it looks like all of the people who want to sell Ukraine out, who want to stop supporting Kiev in this war, are marshaling forces to get this plan on the table, over the head of or underneath Rubio, who's now left scrambling, looking weak, and looking kind of pathetic at the end of the day.
So, one of, I think, the undercurrents of the Halifax International Security Forum this year is how the world or the allies, traditional kind of democratic allies, are responding and reacting and adjusting to the United States being an unreliable partner and abandoning many of its historic and
Yep.
longstanding commitments and values and kind of retreating from what was once like a country that, at least in rhetoric, would uphold like the liberal international order. There's like an ideological shift underway in American foreign policy that is causing and inspiring other countries to want to adjust themselves. But what this incident reveals to me is that this shift also has to be construed in the context of just a sheer incompetence by the Trump administration, that the United States is not only an unreliable partner because ideologically it's shifting, it's also somewhat incompetent as well at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you also have to look at, I think, all of this in the context of the domestic political situation, right? Like the America First crowd has made clear that they're not fond of Marco Rubio in the job of Secretary of State. They would rather an even more oppositional, reactionary, anti globalist, anti multilateralist administration. And I think they've made no secret of the fact that they've been trying to frustrate him in that job. And when domestic concerns and also the internal power struggles of the White House override and supersede the actual foreign policy you're trying to exact or the needs of the world or the actual kind of reality such as it is on the ground, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Taiwan, whether it's in Africa or anywhere else, I think you wind up with a foreign policy that is incoherent, that is slapdash, that is Three Stooges level of tripping over yourself and falling down a flight of stairs.
Around the conference over the last couple of days, what have you seen or deduced from the foreign leaders that you've talked to about the ways in which they're sort of adjusting and guarding themselves against the United States?
They don't know and I don't know and no one knows, right? Like in Johannesburg just yesterday on the margins of the G20, what source told me was kind of the G7 plus plus plus, right? So G7 minus America, but plus plus plus, a bunch of other interested nations are basically just huddling and they spend 45 minutes just trying to infer, break down, and understand what America wants, what it's doing, where it's going, how they fit into it. They did not hear from America. They have no insight into what America wants to do or where it's going. And when that is the sort of state of play, everyone just gets frozen, I think. And speaking to people here, there's this sort of almost fatalism of like, well, they're not going to tell us what they want to do, and all we're going to have to do is react. We don't have any power to influence Trump. We don't know where he wants to go or what he wants to do. So we're just sort of left scrambling to respond. And frankly, there is this mismatch between this rhetoric, and you hear it, I think, most pointedly from Canada, but Emmanuel Macron says it as well. You don't hear it from Keir Starmer, who is just an empty suit, but you hear it from von der Leyen in the EU. You hear it from a lot of world leaders. This idea of, okay, well, America is taking a big step back and it's expecting more from everybody else, and we're going to step forward. We're going to lead. We're going to take the initiative. We're going to be the other part of this, center of Western NATO power. But
Mhm.
you don't actually see it in action, right? Like there's just very little evidence that anyone beyond, increasing defense spending, beyond trying to refashion trade relationships, you see very little evidence that there's new initiative being taken to kind of fill the massive gap left by America. I imagine you see the same thing, especially kind of on the UN and the
Yeah,
multilateralism.
well, let me just maybe push back on that just a little bit. You know, spoken to a few Canadian parliamentarians here, a few Canadian military and Defense Department officials. And one thing I was really struck by was this kind of recognition that what's happening in the United States isn't like a temporarily like retreat, but maybe is something more enduring and more permanent. And therefore, the Canadian government in particular has taken really dramatic steps, particularly on the defense spending side, which I honestly didn't really appreciate until I came here to Halifax, just how profound a investment the government of Canada is making in rebuilding its military, including like a 20% across the board pay raise to all military to improve retention. There's this debate over where should Canada buy its next submarines from. A real sort of massive and quick investment and sharp investment in military spending. Again, I think with the understanding that the United States is not just temporarily an unreliable partner under Trump, but maybe going forward, it will continue to be unreliable. So we need to take matters into our own hands.
There's no doubt some truth to that. And I think defense spending is the one spot where you can say we have concrete, obvious change and desire for, if not leadership, at least contingency planning for a post America world. Okay, fine. But I think when you really zoom in on it, part of the problem here is that the world is uncertain and unable to spearhead initiatives or to own any files because America is doing this sort of Schrodinger's cat version of engagement. They constantly say, we're done, we're tired, we don't want to lead the world anymore, we don't want to be the world's police officer, we're America first, we're not going to be involved unless there's genuine benefit for us. But then Trump says, I want a World Peace Prize and I want to lead all the negotiations and I need to be the guy to secure peace everywhere in the world. How does Europe and Canada step up and become the tip of the spear on Ukraine, such as it is, when America is constantly putting one foot in and one foot out, right? Like, how is it that, let's even say, France becomes the new negotiator with Russia when Trump is constantly meddling in, despite his own insistence that he's not going to be the guy to lead the world anymore? I think that's part of the problem. Everybody is making their positions and their intentions contingent on what America does. And America has just been completely incoherent and hypocritical and do four things at the same time, making it impossible for you to actually step up and do that. And I think that's fundamentally the problem here, but that has got to change at some point. Something has got to give here. We can't keep doing this for 3 years because things will slowly collapse if you constantly have this somewhat schizophrenic approach to world affairs.
I mean, you are seeing a renewed interest in like the age old idea of middle power diplomacy, of the idea that countries like Canada, Australia, European countries would come together around concrete issues, form like bespoke coalitions around those issues, and be the ones taking the charge. This idea has been like around for like a long time, at least since like the late 90s, early 2000s, but there's certainly like a renewed interest in it, but we haven't seen, as you said earlier, real concrete steps by the middle powers to implement that vision. And I don't know if it's like a collective action problem on the part of the middle powers, or if you just need someone like a Macron or a Carney just step up and take the lead on certain issues. But it's like how I would see and expect multilateralism and like a rules-based world order to survive and potentially thrive in this kind of bizarre era in which the United States is retreating. China is creating its own set of rules as well. So how can middle power like Canada step up? And that's the key question, I think, in geopolitics today, but one in which not a single country is really taking the lead just yet.
Yeah, that's right. And, listen, I think when we spent so much of the last 2 decades failing to invest in the machinery of both soft and hard power, it makes it virtually impossible for anyone to do anything independently, and often virtually impossible for them to do so even multilaterally, because we lost the knowledge, know-how, and sort of muscle memory on how to do that properly. Like, there's a question I'm just looking through the comments. SM Carter, points out, why is it that the West is not just stepping up and kind of filling the gap, going all in on Ukraine? And the simple reality is, like, we just don't have the capacity anymore, right? Like, there are additional systems we could be contributing. Like I know for a fact that Canada still has a small cadre of tanks that ostensibly could be donated. We know that there are still some long range missile systems sitting in Europe that could go there. But the basic reality is to do so would also be to deplete our, our resources now that we need to rely on if America does fully retreat. And that is the kind of catch 22 of all of this. Going all in on Ukraine would mean depriving ourselves of the ability to properly defend ourselves going forward. And this massive generational investment is a big deal, but it's going to take 5, 6, 7 years to be fully realized. But what really kills me is that there are things we could do that would have a impact in 6 to 12 months that we're just not doing, right? I was at a dinner last night with some people who were talking about the overwhelming force that Russia is bringing to bear on the Sahel on the propaganda front, right? Like if you're in CAR or Burkina Faso or Mali, you can through your phone get relatively high quality but low bandwidth videos coming straight from the Russian government. You can turn on the radio and catch Russian programming, either in French or English or Russian, and some other languages as well. You can turn on the TV and get Russian programming. They have film screenings, they produce movies in the CAR and elsewhere. Where is Canada? Where is Europe? Where is France? Virtually nowhere. And then you go to the foreign aid side, right? Like we have seen somewhere in the ballpark of $50 billion per year removed from the global aid budget by the death of USAID and some other programs alone. There has not been a willingness by the rest of the world to fill that gap. In fact, Canada, the UK, Germany, a handful of others have cut their foreign aid spending over the last couple of years. I was chatting with OCHA, the UN Humanitarian Relief Organization. They've told me that they're facing a 40% reduction in overall funding, and it's not
Yeah.
just America's fault. That is devastating, right? Like foreign aid is one of those soft power, middle power things that you should do if you want to build new alliances, if you want to avoid conflict, if you want to basically put your elbows up and be relevant in the world. And Canada and Europe is actively stepping back from that. And I find it just completely incoherent.
Yeah, they followed the U.S. lead on that one and used American retrenchment as an excuse to reduce their own foreign aid spending, partly, frankly, also as a consequence of Ukraine. They're increasing their defense spending and taking dollars from foreign aid budgets and putting it towards defense. Should we take a question or two from the audience if there are?
Let's do it.
Go for it.
This is what I really like because Carol Easton is in the comments saying, is there any discussion, serious discussion, but a Commonwealth Trading Union, which I think is very interesting because I wrote a piece about exactly this on my Substack, I don't know, 6 months ago. And the short answer is kind of yes and no. So here's a little fun little tidbit. As you may recall, a year and a half, 2 years ago, Canada had a full diplomatic break with India after credible evidence emerged that India assassinated a Canadian resident
We did a
citizen
whole
on our
episode of the Global
Oh, that's
Dispatches
right.
podcast
I
featuring
forgot
the
all about that.
insights of Justin Ling on this very topic a couple of years ago.
I forgot about that.
You're a regular
Well,
guest.
that's true. Over the last even 2 weeks, Canada has normalized relations with India and have rebooted security dialogue conversations. And here's a little scoop. I know in the next 2 weeks or so, they're going to announce they're rebooting talks around a trade deal, a full free trade agreement, Canada India, which would be pretty seismic. That would start building out the linkages. I mean, we already have a trade deal, obviously, with the UK, with Australia, with New Zealand, building one with India. I mean, we're getting to that point where many of these nations are effectively building a sort of, Anglophone, non-American trade organization. But what you're going to find out, and this has been true for Canada, but it's, I think, also true for many European nations, signing trade deals is great. Building trade infrastructure is really hard, right? Like there's a reason why Europe is hooked on Russian gas because Russia knew the importance of building infrastructure to deliver energy east to west. And Europe didn't really bother building out alternative and contingency infrastructures that would allow it to either sell its energy or acquire energy from elsewhere. Canada is the same problem. Our ports are old. Our railways are in terrible shape. We don't have enough ships. We don't have enough icebreakers. There's a lot of things we're lacking. And you really can't do full trade diversification if you don't have that infrastructure. Now, Mark Carney, I should point out, is investing tens and tens of billions of dollars in figuring this out, but it's slow going.
Any concluding thoughts? if we're back in Halifax a year from now, what topics, what issues will we be discussing then?
Let's be real. I think this time next year, the war in Ukraine will probably still be going on. I think all optimism has left us that there is going to be this sort of sudden rupture. Russia's going to fall. The economy will collapse. Putin will be overthrown. They're going to whatever, right? Like I don't think there's a realistic possibility of peace right now. Like Russia is out there currently, even poo-pooing the current 28-point peace plan, even though they wrote it. Like this is where we're at, right? Like their own negotiating position is not good enough. Ukraine can't say yes to this. Maybe something is going to give. Maybe we'll get lucky, but I don't see it. But I think that starts putting on the table the fact that anybody who's still talking about this rupture and this change in the short term needs to get their optimism shaken out of them, right? Like, this is not a thing that will resolve itself in 6 months. Donald Trump is not going to wake
Mhm.
up 3 months from now and say, oh, God, how wrong was I? In
Yeah.
fact, multilateralism is the most effective way of creating a safe world. Of course, he's not going to do
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
If anything, I think we're going to see an acceleration of the withdrawal, right? Like, at a certain point, Trump is now kind of pursuing foreign policy based on his most recent meeting with MBS. Like, that's
Yeah.
really bad. He's raising the possibility of getting involved in Nigeria. He's raising the possibility of bombing Venezuela. He's raising the possibility of trying to overthrow the South African government. He's raising the possibility of getting involved in Sudan and Haiti. Like, we don't know what he's going to do next.
Yeah.
And frankly, trying to build a plan around it is incredibly irresponsible. But also, you kind of can't come up with a better metaphor for the state of the world than both Halifax and Johannesburg, featuring the both civil society and military brass and diplomatic corps and political class getting together to try and read the tea leaves and interpret smoke signals based on an ostensible ally who won't show up. This is where we're at, and we do have to get to that point where we're not just waiting to see what Trump does, reacting, and then reversing ourselves 12 hours later when we discover it was all a lie. Like, we've got to figure out how you build systems that just don't include America anymore. And everyone likes to talk about it, and no one has figured out how to do it. And everyone's too afraid to actually start the process to make that happen because they're worried if they actually say what they want to do, they'll incur Trump's ire. But we're discovering that you're going to make him mad no matter what you do. So you may as well try and do the right thing. What are your takeaways?
It seems, and Canada seems to be like the starkest example that I've noticed of this sort of acceptance. Perhaps it was reluctant at first, but now, they're in the acceptance stage of grief here in Canada that indeed the United States is not ever going to come back. And if it comes back, it's not going to come back all the way. And I think this shift is probably generational here in Canada as well, to the extent that the partnerships that I think Canadians and maybe Americans as well have kind of taken for granted in the past are not assured in the future. And that what I've heard here in Canada described as like a complacency that America will always be there is not something that Canadians now understand to be true. And so Canada is adjusting itself in the world in new and different ways. And I think Canada is probably more advanced at this than other traditional American allies, if only because Canadian and American economies and cultures are maybe so intertwined that like the breakup, I think, is a little harder and deeper than it would be with other countries. But the breakup is real. And it's something I think that Canadians understand is going to last a long time, is not just the temporary consequence of Donald Trump being in office.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So, everyone, thank you so much for joining this live stream of Global Dispatches. I do this twice a week, every week, sometimes live stream, sometimes straight to the podcast. I feature perspectives of smart people around the world, like Justin Ling. If you're part of my audience, I want you to follow Justin. He is a great international reporter, great talker of all things Canada and international affairs. And I'm so excited about your new YouTube series on soft power. So follow Justin, all the places that you follow people that you appreciate.
Thanks so much for having me. I can't wait to do it next time.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.